In today's video I'll show you how to paint a really awesome looking bronze X step by step simply by making scratches, some edge highlights and a minimum amount of glazing.
Hey guys, I'm Zoltan and you're watching PHLANSMINIATURE. I have painted plenty of swords on the channel so far and even made a speed painting video about painting power swords in 5 minutes, but so far X's have been a little neglected, even though we tend to have quite a few of them wielded by our models. I actually realized this when I was painting an X that came out quite nicely for one of the orcs from the Warcraft starter set. That one took me less than 15 minutes to do, so I thought I would try and see what I could do if I gave myself a little more time to work with. So let's see how you can paint one of those fancy X's you see on Instagram with different colors on the cutting edge and on the face of the X, using only some basic techniques, and I will even throw in a demonic glow effect in the end, which is even easier to do. And by the way, can you guess which model this X belongs to? If you want to copy these steps and paint your own, I uploaded a written guide on my Patreon with all the steps explained, a ton of pictures and all the paints listed. And if you want to see another slightly simpler version of this but painted in steel, there is a guide for that on Patreon too. Alright, let's get some paint on this blade. My first priority is to paint the body or the face of the X, so for now I will leave the actual blade completely black, we will come back to that later. Since we are going for a bronze look, I take a dark reddish brown color, whole red from AK Interactive, and I highlight every edge of the X with this. The lines on these first edge highlights don't have to be particularly thin, since we will paint most of them with brighter colors later on, but every edge should be highlighted. I also make sure that I highlight the edge between the blade and the face of the X. Now, the one that you are painting might not have this sculpted separation line, and in that case simply draw a line wherever you think it's appropriate and designate where the cutting edge is, like I did on this Warcraft orc. The next step is the most important one, but fortunately for us it's super easy and fun. You just have to mess up the X with some scratches and dots, but in a relatively controlled manner. I used the same color, and with the tip of the brush I created a lot of small marks on the body of the X, but I left the cutting edge clean since that will be a different color. I add these marks on the majority of the body of the X, coming in from the edges but also just some random dots and scratches everywhere. The only rule I follow is to concentrate most of them away from the cutting edge, because I want the area next to the big highlights to be darker. Putting a dark area next to the bright one will create contrast and the blade will definitely be brighter than the face. When I am done with that, it's time to blend them together a bit and integrate them into the surface of the X with a glaze. But there is no need to go crazy, 1 or 2 passes will be enough for what we are going for. I'm still using the same color, but I watered it down to around 30% paint and 70% water. I remove most of the moisture from the brush on a paper towel, and then I drag the paint from the middle of the body of the X towards the handle where I want the X to be the brightest. When we are done, the glaze should not fully cover the scratches, just integrate them together. It should only be mostly opaque where the face of the X attaches to the handle, because that's where we want the brightest highlight to be in the end. Alright, now it's time to do the same thing again, but with brighter paint and on a smaller surface. I switch to saddle brown and I paint most of the edges again with this, but this time I'm slightly more careful to be thin and neat, and also I won't paint some of the completely downward facing edges. When that is done, it's time to do another round of scratches and marks. This time I'm more careful and try to make them thinner and mostly centered around the light areas, so that just by overlapping with each other and the previous ones, they start to create a lighter surface towards the handle and away from the cutting edge. And of course, once again I leave the cutting edge clean. Then I create a glaze again with this color, remove the moisture from the brush and glaze again, but this time only inside the area that I glazed before with the whole red and not touching the shadows. And this time I actually did 2 passes, a little thicker one in a smaller area starting from the grooves in the X and moving towards the skull, and then a second thinner one from the other side of the grooves, so a little bit from further in. The goal is simply to create a transition from the darker edge to the brighter parts around the skull. Now it is starting to take shape, and I'm pretty sure you can guess what comes next. We will do it again, but increasing the brightness of the highlight color again. I paint the edge highlights, but this time only painting the edges that are facing up towards where the light is coming from. The edges that face down I either leave in the previous color or I add a couple of dots only. I also try to be significantly thinner and neater this time, at least as much as I can. Then I will do the marks again, but concentrate them even further away from the blade. And I follow that up with the usual glaze of the same color. The final highlight steps I will do with luminous flash on an even smaller surface, and now I'm only painting the edges facing up, concentrating my scratches and glazing to be as close to where the chef meets the face of the X as possible. And with that, the highlighting is done on the face of the axe, but it looks a little washed out and rough, so let's make it a little nicer. I will use Mornfang Brown from Citadel because it's one of my favorite saturated brown colors and it is fantastic for glazing. I dilute it down to the usual 70-30 glaze and drag it from roughly the middle of the axe towards the blade. This will bring back the color, and while you will be able to see the scratches underneath it, it will blend them together. Ideally, you should try to avoid the edge highlights that we had done earlier, but if you go over them, they only take a couple of seconds to redo. Next, I will take a little wine red and create another glaze, but this time make it even thinner, something like 80-90 water and 10-20% paint, since this color has a ton of pigments and I don't want to just turn the blade red. I glaze this between the shadows and the beginning of the midtone, so basically very close to the almost pure black area we left next to the cutting edge. This will add even more color and saturation, which we lacked a little bit so far. And now it's time for the secret sauce to tie everything together, and that is dark sea blue. This color is pure magic for this kind of application. We will glaze it mixed in with around 30% water into the darkest shadows, but overlap it with the reddish tinted areas a bit. This will give a ton of depth into the shadows and a little greenish blue tint to the whole blade, which is great since people tend to associate verdigris with bronze anyway. I even added a couple of little dots of this further into the brighter parts of the axe to enhance this further.
And that's it, the axe is finished. Just kidding, we still have to do the cutting edge, but that should require less steps and time since we are going to be using only 2 colors this time.
In fact, I will continue using dark sea blue, but this time as the first highlight color for our blade. It is one of the best starting colors for metals, and in this case it will help us sell the idea that the face and the blade belong to the same axe, despite looking completely different otherwise. Usually on the cutting edge I create 2 big highlights, one on the top and a slightly smaller one at the bottom, like for example on this other axe from the Patreon tutorial. And yeah, I know that's a shameless plug, but it's actually relevant. But this particular axe has the cutting edge divided into 4 sections by sculpted edges, so I will create highlights in all 4, but later I will concentrate the brighter highlights on the top 2. With this first color I paint all the edges and around 90% of the blade as well, leaving only some small deep shadows in full black. I'm painting it as the first highlight, but in the end dark sea blue will be our shadow color. With that done, it's time to start with some proper highlights. I mix some ice yellow into the dark sea blue, something like 20%, and I start to really define where the highlight should be. In this case I decided that my biggest highlight will be in the upper middle of the blade, essentially in the second segment on this particular axe, with a smaller one on the very top of the blade. On the other side I will do it a bit differently and make the top segment the brightest one. I did this rather arbitrarily here, but when you paint it on an actual model, the orientation of the axe might help you decide where to place it, but in general the brightest highlight should be close to the top. For the next highlight I mixed in even more ice yellow, around like 30-40% into the dark sea blue, and painted all of the edges again except the most downward facing ones. Then I painted smaller highlight areas inside the big highlights, leaving some of the previous colors still visible. And just like on the face of the axe, I painted small dots and scratches on the transition line to make it easier to blend the 2 colors together. Finally, I thinned down the same mix to a glaze and dragged it from the darker area towards the middle of the highlight to smooth things out. And you would never guess what I did next. I mixed in even more ice yellow and repeated the same steps again, but this time concentrating only on the upward facing edges and only making a couple of dots on the ones facing down. I also reduced the size of the volumetric highlights quite drastically this time and made sure that my edge highlights and scratches are getting really thin and neat. And once again I glazed the transition with a very thin glaze of the same mix. Finally, I used some almost pure ice yellow and repeated the same steps again, but now really only concentrating on painting the upper half of the blade with the thinnest scratches and edge highlights I could manage. At this point it's quite likely that you have lost a little of the color and contrast from the shadows because you over-highlighted a bit. If that's the case, you can fix that quite easily with a little thin glaze of dark sea blue into the shadows, dragging it from the midtones. When I was happy with the shadows and the midtones, I added the final touches to my highlights with a little pure white. I use this very sparingly, only to paint some partial edges on the upper half of the blade and the very middle of the big highlights. But I also added a couple of bright elements on the lower half of the blade, just a couple of dots and some short edge highlights here and there for added contrast. And that's the axe done, but if you have some sculpted details like I have on this one, we can add a little extra chaosy blink to it. For this I painted the inside of the recess with pure white and used multiple layers to make sure I have full coverage. I also painted the sides of the recess and a little around it as well. I didn't use any trickery to do this, just a brush with a nice tip, but if you want to, you can mix in some flow improver into the white and it will just flow into the recessed area. I made sure that the white was fully dry and then I painted everything that was white with warp lightning contrast. It is better to paint a second coat for full coverage once the first one dries. After that I painted the very bottom of the recesses with white again, leaving the sides of the recess in this green contrast color. Finally, I used Tesseract Glow contrast to paint the white parts. This contrast paint is almost fluorescent, but some actual yellowish green fluo paint would also be good for this. I simply dropped this into the middle of the recess to cover the whites. I also painted it a little on the edge of the recess to make it look like it's glowing. And with that, the axe is finished and the end result looks like this.
I hope you guys found this useful, and if you did, don't forget to like and subscribe, and check out my Patreon for the written guide about this and the steel axe as well. Thank you very much for watching, I really appreciate your support, see you in the next one.